But have you ever seen, you've traveled the world all over the place, you've seen the absolute worst situations. Have you ever seen a technology take ordinary people and just put them in extraordinary situations and just changes their path?
Yeah, well, I think that things were probably similar. I know a lot of you remember the beginnings of the internet and the email culture in some aspects, right? Because anybody could use it in theory. And the early adopters knew that it was going to change the world, even though people on TV and in the newspapers said it was a fad. If you remember people making fun of the internet, they called it, the internet superhighway and it's going to go to nowhere. And there's all these videos of people on television, David Letterman and many famous talk show hosts, and they would have people on like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and they would basically make fun of them to not using the internet, right? I mean, to me, it's similar to okay, you are mailing stuff in the post, and now you have email. There might be some times where you're sentimental and you want to mail somebody something. Sure, great. But we're going to use email for 95%, 99% of stuff. And that's really how I feel about the Bitcoin shift, right? Where we have a moment now where we can have these community events, and there's a ideological aspect to Bitcoin that's kind of missing from the internet adoption and from the adoption from of email, because it's more about your time and the fruit of your labor, and it's more about really taking down just a very corrupt global system in a slightly different way. In terms of the telecommunications companies, sure they were monopolists, but they weren't corrupt and exploitative in the same way that the banking cartels are, right? This is a little different. This is a little heavier, which is why I think it's going to hit a little harder. But at the end of the day, early internet culture was a cool thing. People were a part of it all over the world. It was really exciting, and we knew it was the future. And we don't have that anymore. And now it's just like we all use the internet. There's no more like internet conferences, or the Juno email conference. No, we just use email. So I think we're part of a very special moment here. So I think you're all looking ahead of the curve. You're sharp for being here, being part of this, introducing your families and friends to this. I think in 10 years, the biggest regret we're all going to have is that we didn't teach more people about Bitcoin. Of course, Pete, you're going to regret that you didn't stack harder, right? And stay more humble, of course. But I think the biggest regret is you're going to say, man, I wish I had told more people about this thing, which is how I think a lot of us feel who've been in the space for any more than 1, 2, 3, 4 years is, man, I wish I had told more people 10 years ago, 5 years ago than I did. So get out there, evangelize this thing, talk about it, and know that it's going to penetrate and change the world in the same way that things like the internet did, where it's going to start with small communities. Back then it was scientific communities, academic communities, people interested in domains and selling stuff on the internet. I remember the first time I ever saw an Amazon box at my friend's house in 1997, I think. I was like, this is weird. What's Amazon? And then it takes over. Bitcoin's going to do the same thing. And if you think about Bitcoin adoption, we're probably roughly around the year 2000 when it comes to internet adoption. So, a lot of us had dial-up modems. It was a pain in the ass to connect to the internet. It was hard, but of course you were doing it, and you knew you weren't going backwards to a world where you didn't have it. And then 10 years later, we had the iPhone, right? So I think we're in that moment now where Bitcoin is a little hard to approach for a lot of people, still a little clunky, way better than it was 5 years ago. But we don't have the iPhone yet, right? Like if you think about the fact that there's a great group of people here, but 95% of Juno doesn't know what's going on, right? Well, what that means is that 95% of creatives, product designers, UX designers, marketers, people managing family businesses, they don't know what's going on. So they're not in the space yet. So they can't add their uniqueness to the space yet. So that's going to change. And so many cool ideas and people are going to come in. And I really firmly believe this. And I'll conclude with this. In the year 2050, if it still exists, Time Magazine or whatever does a 10 most important people in Bitcoin's history list. So if we go forward 25 years from now, I really believe that at least 7 of those people haven't entered Bitcoin yet. So you might have, of course, Satoshi, Hal, maybe Dorsey and a few other people. But I really believe that 6, 7 of those people haven't come into the space yet. And that's what really fills me with a lot of excitement, is all the people that are going to join the ride as we move forward. Many of whom are just getting into it now.
And speaking of Liz Warren,
Sucks.
is it not hilarious that she said like Bitcoin was for criminals, but now today, the horse is in the gates and JP Morgan, likely the biggest criminal institution, they have had some pretty interesting clients over the years. Look it up. But is Elizabeth Warren actually right now?
Well, I think Elizabeth Warren's just part of the past. I mean, she devoted her life to, in a lot of cases, you'll see people who sense a problem, they're correct. And thank you. But they don't have a good solution. When I was doing a lot of research about the IMF and the World Bank, which we can get into, I noticed that a lot of Marxists were actually the most, I would say, astute sort of people diagnosing this issue of these more powerful countries and empires exploiting poor countries. They actually wrote really well about it. Unfortunately, their solution totally sucked, which was support like Marxist revolutionaries in the developing world or whatever. So Elizabeth Warren, same thing. Like, she notices there's a real problem in the banking sector. She notices that there's an issue with bank bailouts. She notices there's an issue with essentially, socializing the losses and privatizing the gains, right, of this system. But her solution totally sucks, right? It's like expand the power of the state. So I think it's unfortunate for her that essentially the solution to what she's been working for her whole career has come along, and she's just too egotistical, to not humble enough to accept that and to work with that, which would be so powerful. I mean, it's honestly, it's kind of funny. It's I mean, and I know a lot of early Bitcoiners came from the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? This is literally occupying Wall Street right now. Like, Bitcoin is occupying Wall Street, right? Yeah, literally occupying Wall Street, and she can't sort of acknowledge that, which is really unfortunate. But yeah, what you alluded to is it's been around for a very long time, since the earliest days of Bitcoin. Basically, anything we're saying about Bitcoin was probably said on the Bitcoin forums and Bitcoin talk in the first 3 years of Bitcoin. Everything is just we're just repeating the past. But one of the things people said back then was that Bitcoin would be kind of like a Trojan horse. And I've written a lot about this. And I've debated a lot of people on this, because people are like, wait, you're a human rights activist. Aren't you upset that large corporations, banks, and nation states are adopting Bitcoin? Like, aren't you upset by that? And my response is, no, I'm actually pretty excited by that. And that's affirming Bitcoin's rise. If Bitcoin wasn't going to be used by if it was never being adopted by anybody, then nobody would use it, right? Like, we would have the opposite problem. The way that you would understand that Bitcoin is failing is if it never got adopted by anybody. That's how you would tell Bitcoin is failing. We would be very naive to think that something could go from zero, which is what Bitcoin traded at for its first year or so, $0. Like, no one was willing to buy it for any amount of money, essentially for at least a year after Satoshi started the network. The tokens were literally worthless, to whatever it is today, worth more than $100,000 per token. The only way you get from A to B is with a lot of other people noticing and getting involved. And then we're eventually going to go to 1 million, or wherever we go. It would be naive to think that only a small group of cypherpunks on the internet were going to be part of that. Everybody's going to be part of that. And that's how you can tell that we're going from, again, zero to what I think is going to be the world reserve currency one day, the dominant currency of the world. And you only get there by having people you don't like adopt it. Bitcoin is for enemies. Look, unfortunately for human rights activists, that means that a lot of people are going to adopt it.
So, Alex,
But the good news is that it means it takes power away from them, which is amazing.
Larry Fink the Grinch who bought Bitcoin?
I think Larry Fink is going through a learning phase like everybody else. Everybody's a student of Bitcoin. And Larry Fink and Jamie Dimon, at first, they were like, this is a stupid idea. Stay away from this. It's a scam, right? Which is what a lot of people in traditional finance said for the first 10 years, which is very unfortunate for them, obviously. And then they started coming around to it. I can say this because I've met Larry Fink, and I had meetings because I was trying to explain the human rights aspect of this to some of these folks on Wall Street. for my own human rights, self-interested reasons. I want them to be involved in Bitcoin because everybody who's involved in Bitcoin makes Bitcoin stronger. Again, this is the Trojan horse idea. Bitcoin's an open network. So I don't care whether you're doing mining or shilling financial products built on Bitcoin or working on Bitcoin apps or helping Americans get exposure to the Bitcoin price through retirement funds. It doesn't really matter to me. The more people working on Bitcoin, the stronger Bitcoin is. So I thought it would be awesome to get more people involved in this, which I consider the highest form of the struggle for freedom. And I could tell that, a couple of years ago, they were starting to change their minds. And then all of a sudden they realized they could make a killing on it, and they have. So today, in less than 2 years, IBIT, which is BlackRock, Larry Fink's essentially, the ETF that BlackRock has created to get Bitcoin exposure, I think it's their second most profitable ETF that they have. And pretty soon it's going to be number one, which is really insane.
Past their S&P 500 fund.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be their number one. And you know what? I mean, I think that's to be expected. I think a lot of Americans are smart and they realize what's going on and they want some exposure to that. Now, hopefully they self-custody as well. I think it needs to be holistic here. But clearly, if you've got a pile of money that you can't withdraw and you can't self-custody, yeah, I mean, I understand why people would want exposure to that as opposed to like Monster energy drink or whatever, which is, I think, the other best performing stock over the last 15 years, which says a lot about society, actually. But basically, all these people are in a transition from haters to getting on board. And guess what? Now they're fighting for Bitcoin. Maybe not necessarily for self-custody and privacy, which is why we need to do that. But they're going to go to Washington and be like, don't ban this thing. We want to use it, which is pretty crazy to see, actually. And the speed which we went from in 2019 and 20, everybody said the government was going to ban Bitcoin. Every single journalist I talked to said this. So in 5 years to go from that to now the new criticism is, oh, the government's adopting Bitcoin. It's pretty amazing to watch. Like, what do you mean? I thought you said they were going to ban it. Now you're upset that they're adopting it. You need to get your story straight. And it's exactly what was sort of predicted on early Bitcoin talk forums. Like, this thing's just going to continue to rise and get adopted by more and more people. And you have the normalization of it, the hyperbitcoinization, where it's now, I mean, it's over $100,000 today for one Bitcoin. Most people are completely, they don't care at all. They're not totally tuned out. It's insane. I mean, more people were interested, actually, I would guess, based on Google search stuff, in Thanksgiving of 2017. Retail interest in Bitcoin totally peaked, right? Everybody was talking about it at like Thanksgiving or whatever, and it was at like $10,000. So it's gone up by a 10x and less, so fewer people are interested. That's hyperbitcoinization. You're watching it happen. It's a normalization of something. And eventually it's going to be 200,000, 500,000, a million, way beyond. And yet people are going to kind of not really realize what's going on.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and give us a pamp while we take a moment to recognize the masters of Bitcoin sovereignty, the Bitcoin way. Learn how to secure your generational wealth and take self-custody of your Bitcoin. The Bitcoin way is your #1 spot to learn how to Bitcoin and to reclaim your privacy. Learn how to run a node and start your journey towards Bitcoin freedom today. Looking to get started? You can use the link in the show notes to set up a free 30-minute consultation today. You ever mention hardware wallets to your friends, or how the state is working to build a digital panopticon to enslave people with CBDCs, and they just ask if you caught the game last night? Well, the Orange Pill app has got you covered. The Orange Pill app is the single largest repository of Bitcoin-only events in the world. Connect with over 16,000 other Bitcoiners in real life. Bitcoin is better with friends, and now you can zap them instantly all in one app. Download the Orange Pill app today, get a gold card, go hit a meetup, and who knows? The connections you make could last a lifetime. I kind of feel like we were talking there. It's like the culmination, too, to fuel the adoption. We got the Trojan horse inside the gates. But when democracies are obsessed with freezing accounts, silencing dissent, and even the EU reallocating people's savings, I think it's becoming blatantly obvious, like fiat money has become a mechanism of control. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so if you read Lynn Alden's awesome book, Broken Money, it's a scientific history of money, basically. And the first 60% doesn't talk about Bitcoin. It just talks about how did we go from, the money systems we used thousands of years ago to essentially 1971. And what you'll see is that the gold system was always going to lose to fiat because it's not digital. So as soon as they were able to do telegrams across the Atlantic Ocean to change balances in people's accounts, I mean, gold was basically over because you're not going to do ship settlement on boats across an ocean when you can update ledgers, fiat debt credit ledgers in minutes or hours, right? So that was the beginning of the end for that system. No one had invented digital gold yet. So I agree with her. 1,000 times out of 1,000 times, if you run it back, gold's going to lose to fiat at that moment because we didn't have digital gold. We just didn't have scarcity on the internet. And that led our society to a lot of, I would say, interesting, scary, tragic, complex things in the 20th century as we changed into a purely fiat system. But now we're undergoing a new change. Someone invented digital scarcity essentially, and now we're going to go through I think an equally powerful transformation. But I think for the better, because what she points out towards the end of the book, which is brilliant, is that essentially money was at one point way back when more of an instrument of your control, individual sovereignty, and relative privacy. If you're using non-digital, if you're using analog money, you have pretty good privacy over it. You can self-custody it to an extent, things like that. We went through it like 150 years where scientifically we just moved into money being an instrument of state control, where it was becoming increasingly digital, programmed. They could take it from you, they could censor it, they can program it. Now that's getting even crazier with things like CBDCs, right, where it's going to be citizen, you've reached your caloric limit for the day, stuff like that. It's actually happening in China as we speak. It's crazy, but it's true. And then Bitcoin's just a completely different paradigm, where the more we evolve Bitcoin and the more we advance Bitcoin, the freer we get. It's pretty wild, but it's very exciting.
It's incredible. And thinking of, I was having this thought, like, is democracy even possible with when you inject central banks and fiat incentives into a system? It seems like that's the 51% attack on liberty, and kind of Bitcoin entering the gates is the answer to all of that. But is democracy just naturally on that slope to authoritarianism when you inject fiat into it?
Yeah, well, that's why I'm wearing the hat. So shout out to Finite Supply, Skylar. You guys should all check out his stuff. It's beautiful, beautiful Bitcoin equipment, I would say. The founders of the United States, thinking a lot about yesterday, Independence Day. Happy Independence Day, everybody. Did not like the idea of central banking. They did not necessarily like the idea of fiat. They liked the idea of privacy and of civil liberties. And they wrote about it pretty extensively if you read the Bill of Rights and other things that came out of that time period, especially Declaration of Independence, et cetera, right? Like, yeah, no, and some of the founding father-esque figures were more into centralization, and that was the early debate over our country. Yeah, the more Hamiltonian side of things. Ironically, the city of Boston launched a CBDC pilot with MIT, and they called it Project Hamilton. So, there were impulses from the very beginning to centralize. And look, there were good arguments on that side of things. But ultimately, that's why we moved to Washington. The capital ended up moving to Washington as a compromise out of this. And there's a lot to be learned from those early years of the big debate between should we have a central bank, should we not? Should we have a national bank, should we not? But at the end of the day, the idea of a central bank has really, in my view, nothing to do with democracy, just the word being, basically power of the people as opposed to power of one person or two people or of kleptocrats or whatever. There's many ocracies, right? There's kleptocracy, there's thugocracy, there's autocracy. I'm not a fan of power being held by one person or even just a handful of people. I like the idea of everybody being sort of in control. Now, ultimately, what does that look like in society? It's impossible to scale that past like families in small towns, right? It's pretty hard to do, to have a pure, independent everybody's sovereign and free system. So at some point, because you want to live your life, you want to like be an artist, or you want to do this or that. You don't necessarily want to be involved with, you know, uh, patrolling the environment or being a Coast Guard or whatever. So we end up delegating some of that to other authorities, and that's the Republic. That's the American Republic, right? But I think that by integrating Bitcoin and evolving Bitcoin through our system, if you think of America like a body, like some sort of spirit, right? I think we'll be much stronger because there's nothing that we have to fear from basically technology that puts money more in the hands of the people. I don't think anybody should be afraid of that in our country, at least. That should be very exciting. And the people who are afraid of it are essentially treasonous, right? So they need to get out of here. And we need to be more comfortable with more people having control over money. I think other governments are totally screwed. Totalitarian governments, communist governments, other kinds of governments that require censorship and confiscation and rely on it are going to crumble eventually, is my belief. I just don't see how they last through a transformation where people have gradually more control over their money. And they can't print money to bail out their mistakes.
100%. I think you can't have like a communist system without a central bank, which makes sense on why communists and
Correct.
dictators despise.
Yeah, they want to own the means of production, which means some cartel of people is to be in charge of the way you're paid and the technology you're paid. Honestly, I think some of the early, I always wonder what like Marx would have thought about Bitcoin, but like, it's funny because what he was trying to do in some aspect was like increase the power of the wage earner, of like the laborer, right?
Makers and takers.
Well, what's the most powerful way you can increase the power of one of the most powerful ways you can increase the power of the laborer is to make sure they have control over their own wages and the fruit of their labor, and that it's in something where their purchasing power increases over time, or at least is protected over time. So, ironically, I think Bitcoin is like the most pro-union, pro-labor technology ever created. So it's interesting how it can be viewed by different people on different sides of the spectrum, right? And honestly, some hyper-capitalist institutions thrive on fiat. Like they thrive on being able to crush the worker by issuing them these fiat credits, which then they devalue, right? So there's you can look at it from different perspectives, but at the end of the day, if people are earning Bitcoin and they're learning how to self-custody it, and they're taking responsibility for them and their family and their community, and they're teaching other people how to do that, I think that can be seen as pro-labor, pro-workers' rights, and obviously it's pro-free market too. So I think it really splits the difference nicely.
It actually does something and doesn't just LARP about it and put up picket signs,
right? Exactly.
Wear wigs and
stuff.
stuff.
The greatest protest of all time. I think if you run the numbers, the biggest protest of all time,
Boston?
In the streets there were huge protests against, obviously, the Vietnam War, the end of the Cold War in different communist regimes. The Iraq War had huge protests. There's been huge protests in countries like India over different things. But if you think about the fact that if you run the numbers, there's many, many millions of people who use Bitcoin. And we can argue about, well, what does using Bitcoin mean? But there's a new study coming out of Cornell University that looks at Bitcoin adoption in different countries. And the numbers are going to shock people when they see this thing. I mean, maybe we aren't surprised, but we're talking 10, 20, 30% of big countries where people have Bitcoin or have used it before.
But Elizabeth Warren said he can't do it for anything.
Elizabeth Warren sucks. So, I mean, we're probably talking tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people who've at least used it at some point, right? So, I mean, that's the biggest uncoordinated peaceful protests ever, which is really beautiful.
Decentralized all across the board. So we had representatives from local, state, federal government here in Alaska talking about Bitcoin and spreading freedom technology. Absolutely insane, like to think about just a few years ago. But those are elected officials, democracy, and that's how it works. We choose our representatives. But we got unelected D-bags at the Fed and the IMF. Right. What are these people? The IMF, what do they do?
Soup organizations, yeah. Well, look, a lot of these institutions, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. A lot of them were created with relatively good intentions, right? Like there were a lot of crises in the United States when we had they didn't have Bitcoin, right? So it's always like if you don't have Bitcoin, your monetary solutions are going to be very imperfect. So they had all these different currencies across the United States, and it was really messy, and it was sort of hard for there to be coordinated insurance markets. And if you dig into it, like there were like some good reasons to standardize money across the United States. And there's obviously some good reasons to have a lender of last resort, right? So in the same way that you had money centralized in the United States, after we defeated the Nazis basically in World War II, as that war was winding down, we with our allies and well at the time with our allies, the Soviets at the time, we gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, and we sat at a hotel, the Americans, the Soviets, and 40 some odd other countries, and we tried to come up with the new financial system for the world. Everybody else wanted something called a Bancor. So the Bancor,
Keynes.
well, yeah, Keynes, but also the other countries wanted a more globally distributed reserve currency that would be like a basket of currencies and goods. But America had all the gold because we didn't get torn up at home as much as these other countries. We had a huge basically importation of gold. As we sold things to the world, they paid us in gold. So we sold all kinds of things. We got paid. We also got gold as part of like some of the borrowing, the lend lease stuff. So we basically got to have our way. We had the most gold. We got to have our say. And we said, no, 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 it's going to be the dollar pegged to gold. So we put this together, and part of that system was the global trade system. So at the same hotel and the same conference where we came up with the dollar was going to be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, right? Which would last essentially for about 25 years. We also came up with the IMF and the World Bank, and they were at the beginning reasonable institutions. Like the World Bank was just supposed to basically fund projects in war-torn Europe and Japan where private capital couldn't have an appetite to do so. And the IMF was supposed to be a lender of last resort for essentially Europe and Japan when they couldn't make a payment. We didn't want the world trade system to melt down, so there would be like a pool of money where they could borrow from to keep going so that they could keep buying and selling things on the global market. The whole goal was to not have the crash that happened in the 1930s where everybody withdrew from global trade. They wanted it to keep going, right? And that's sort of what it did. But the problem is, instead of closing down, which a lot of actually libertarian economists said it should in the early 70s, they were like, we should shut this thing down. It served its purpose. It took on a new life, which was basically exploiting other countries. It started to engage in debt colonialism. So colonialism basically ended around 1960 formally. The Western powers and the Eastern powers were no longer, quote unquote, allowed to do straightforward colonialism, right? That kind of ended, even though, as we know, it didn't quite end, but more or less it ended. What didn't end was monetary colonialism. So what ended up happening is that instead of using like a ship with guns and cannons and going just taking over and enslaving an area, you would just find some military dictator, do a deal with them, and make enormous amounts of loans in dollars that they could obviously never pay back. So the only way they can pay it back is to borrow more and more and more, and this creates the debt trap. So we ensnared all these different countries in debt traps so we could basically change their economy. We could change them to be agriculturally dependent on us instead of themselves, and we could change it so that they would make things that we would need instead of what they would need. And this is essentially what we did, and this was very coordinated. I mean, you can look at the U.S. Secretaries of Agriculture and Commerce and all these things over the years and look at their statements. The goal was to increase American power, and obviously there was some understandable aims to that, but the outcomes were pretty tragic on the world. You have most of these smaller countries, their average debt in the early 1970s was like $100 million, and today it's $100 billion. And their population, their economy have not grown at that same rate, right? So a lot of times people are like, well, yeah, of course, things were so much cheaper 50 years ago, but the problem is the rate at which currency debasement happens does not track the rate of wages and things like that in most cases. And internationally, we saw the same thing. So I have a book called Hidden Repression that dives into this system. But the reality is, and the important thing for, even communities up here, I mean, there's been obviously insane history in Alaska even. But I mean, if you want to talk about what happened in World War II, there was basically massive ethnic cleansing of the Aleutian Islands of indigenous peoples here, like not that far from here. And, people are taken from their land all over the world. The difference here is that you can opt out, right? So if you're going through hyperinflation in the 1980s in some country that's undergoing structural adjustment, there's nothing you can do. Today, you can convert your time and energy to Bitcoin, and you can at least in a small way escape. And I think that's really cool and very inspiring. So that's why in the front cover of Hidden Repression, I have written for the victims of development, they may never get the justice they deserve, but they may get a way out. And I think that's the way to look at this. Like maybe finally we have a technology that can reach anybody. And really that's what it's doing. Regardless of what the alphabet soup organizations say, or the Red Cross or the UN, oh, we're going to like save the world or whatever. There are places they won't go. There are things they won't touch for political reasons, but Bitcoin's there. So regardless of what you guys care about here politically, it doesn't really matter. Bitcoin doesn't care. So regardless of how you feel about highly politicized causes like Gaza or Ukraine, or Sudan or Yemen or whatever,
Help anyone who
doesn't
needs
care. Bitcoin's going to be there, right? And we may not be there for X reason or Y reason in terms of American aid. And the other thing you need to think about, which is so crazy, is that all of our aid, all these billions of dollars of aid that have flowed around the world since the 70s and like the creation of the aid industry, the goal was never to improve the monetary technology of the people receiving the aid. Never. The goal was almost always dependence, because what would happen is, again, dollars would go to the dictator or the local rulers.
the people never get them.
And then the people were given these terrible fiat credits that were only like casino tokens. They can't be used outside the country, and they get devalued really easily. And it's a scam. It's basically like the dollars go here, and then the rulers get the dollars, and then they mint these credits to the people. So the whole system has been like a
Completely closed system.
So now people can escape from that. They can save in Bitcoin. It's really crazy to see. I talked to all these people in Cuba, of all places, in the year 2020, more or less, and they had been saving. They'd started to save in Bitcoin. And get this. So since then, their currency is completely hyperinflated. The communist regime is collapsing. They can't provide anything for the people. They're stealing what they can, but it's not much left. So the peso has collapsed by 90%. Okay. Bitcoin has increased by 2,000%. So it's really a matter of life and death. I mean, imagine that. Your choices were lose 90% of your current and future savings, or be up 2,000%. And that's just in the last 5 years. Think about that difference. So this thing is just so enormously important for everybody.
Benefiting the lives everywhere. And that's what's so good. Like if the IMF actually meant what their mission was,
like giving Bitcoin to people, or at least US dollars. I mean, as much as we can talk about stablecoins, maybe they're sending Tether to all these poor people. And at least the dollar, for what you want to say about the dollar, and we can talk a lot about the dollar, but it's the best fiat currency in the world. So if we're going to live in the fiat standard for now, right?
The original shitcoin.
Yeah, like you should want everybody to have the best shitcoin if we're going to do that, right? Yeah. But they don't. Like they clearly don't, because they don't do the dollar thing. So you know what? People are adopting stablecoins, and I empathize with that. Like if you're in Lebanon or Argentina or Turkey or something, and your currency's down 50% in the last year against the dollar, I understand why you want stablecoins. But I guess my point is, be careful. They're not freedom money. They can be censored. They can be rugged. They can go to zero.
Yeah, just like you said with that closed casino system.
Yeah.
Right? This is a stable coin is just a private CBDC. Yeah. And what will the state do? Just like with the Twitter files,
well, they're going to do.
They'll export their.
They're also going to do shotgun KYC. I think.
Exactly.
I don't see how the stable coins go from 250 billion, which is what they are now, to 2 trillion without some kind of regulation KYC thing. And at that point, the humanitarian use case is kind of toast. But I think for now that they serve a use case. Just be careful with them. But I think people are pretty on it. For example, 3 or 4 years ago, a lot of people wanted stablecoins from the organization that I work for. We give grants around the world to support different activism, and people were actually asking for stablecoins. We haven't had anybody ask us for stablecoins in like 3 years. Everybody wants Bitcoin. So I think people have learned in many ways, and part of that's just the cycle that we're in, right? But I think people are getting it that, with Bitcoin, you can truly be self-custodial. If you want to, you can be very private. You can use privacy tools in a way you can't really with stablecoins. And there's the global monetary liquidity of Bitcoin. Like stablecoins are basically dollars issued on all these different nonsense blockchains that aren't compatible with each other. So it's like you almost have to go to some marketplace and say, hey, I have this stablecoin on this blockchain. Who's willing to trade it with me? There's only one Bitcoin, so it's just like everybody speaks one language, which is why I think it'll be quite effective. Yeah.
So thinking about the IMF, like the loan sharking, using the debt, and they obviously want to kill Bitcoin adoption, despite what's been going on in Bhutan. They kind of gave them the middle finger.
Right.
They're killing it. El Salvador kind of rebelling, but Pakistan with mining, the IMF just crashed down on them.
Mhm.
A lot of curiosity about what's going on in El Salvador and other countries with Bitcoin adoption.
Well, I mean, El Salvador was the first country to try and really go into Bitcoin for different reasons. And that experiment, it's not over, but essentially they gave up and they submitted back to the fiat system to take more money from the IMF. So as a result, you can read about this on John Dennehy's thread, the Mi Primer Bitcoin guy. There's many, many people involved in Mi Primer Bitcoin, but one of the founders has been chronicling this, and he's living down there, and he's basically shown how this is a country that had an opportunity to really stand independent and free and gave that up to take more dollars from the machine. So he shows this, and as a condition of taking this loan, they had to really end a lot of the Bitcoin activities that they had once sort of set up. Same thing in a lot of other countries. Argentina, when it took money from the IMF, they had to promise to crack down on Bitcoin stuff. So
And still the central bank is still there. We're hoping.
yeah, I mean, we'll see. That's a longer conversation. But the point is, what's crazy is there's clearly a group of people who work at the IMF whose job it is to, how can we fight Bitcoin adoption? Which is pretty crazy. We're in the fight you stage. I don't think they'll win in the end, but they are going to make it hard for any smaller country that's trying to do Bitcoin work. And then maybe with just the couple minutes we have left, I mean, we should just talk about mining for a sec. I mean, what's going to end up changing the minds of all these people is mining, because at the end of the day, and I know we're going to hear some awesome innovative ideas about mining. I mean, the Bitcoin network will come in and pay you for energy, as opposed to you as a government having to tax or borrow to build energy infrastructure. The Bitcoin network will pay you to build out your energy infrastructure. And I've seen this in different countries around the world, Latin America and Africa. I've visited these mines and seen this. Like, you had places with very little energy infrastructure, and all of a sudden there's Bitcoin miners coming in. This allows the local power companies to make more money, to build out more infra. It enables people to pay less money for their energy bill, and the Bitcoin miners make money. And it's amazing to watch. And eventually this is going to be, I think, how Bitcoin wins in that global sense is through mining, because I think that most of these countries have enormous stranded or unused or untapped, essentially sustainable energy reserves in terms of geothermal, solar, wind, hydro, whatever it is. There's massive energy abundance, but there's never been a capitalistic way to get in there and make it happen until now. So now that we have Bitcoin, it's going to start bootstrapping all of this. So all these countries can, in the future, instead of like last resort, you borrow from the IMF or from some alphabet soup organization or from the Chinese to get what you need. Well, what if you could just convert your enormous, abundant energy reserves into Bitcoin to buy what you need? It'll be on the margin. It won't be like 80% of your GDP, but in economics, the margin's everything. So having a little bit of fully sovereign freedom money for all these countries will be really important, because my view is that eventually large companies and corporates, where we win is when they start selling stuff for Bitcoin. And that's where we all win in the end. And that's why, the merchant adoption stuff is important. We'll see how it's going to take a long time. But hyperbitcoinization is not $1 million or $10 million or you being able to save in Bitcoin on Wall Street. Hyperbitcoinization is when you can use Bitcoin as freedom money anywhere, including countries buying oil in it or countries buying wheat or grain in it. So that's where I think we eventually go. And in that world, it's much harder to do this kind of fiat global scam system that we're running today. And I think America, will be much stronger in a Bitcoin standard than it is today for many reasons, and will be less exploitative. And we can even be more proud of this country that we're already very proud of. So that's my hope for the future.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm starting to think, if democracy is going to be saved and the republic's restored, it won't be with ballots. It's going to be with Bitcoin.
Well, you can vote by opting into Bitcoin, basically.
This is
If
the
you
way.
don't want to, if you don't want to vote at the ballot box. I think both can be very useful, and you'll hear from a very interesting congressman tomorrow who has been in Bitcoin for a very long time.
Diamond hands.
Well, he also lost like 400 coins on Mt. Gox, which I'll tell you about. But I mean, he's been in the space for a very long time, and I think there's an interesting intersection of of democratic elected politicians and Bitcoin. And here's the cool part: unlike a dictatorship where the king can just say Bitcoin's illegal, blah blah blah. I think that's the last thing I'll say is that I think within 5 years, like basically the next election cycle, it'll be political suicide for any politician to be anti-Bitcoin. And either way, we win. So thank you guys so much. We'll see you tomorrow.
Elizabeth Warren!
Sucks.
And for the hashing enthusiasts and those looking to dive into or learn more about the world of Bitcoin mining, you don't want to miss Mining Disrupt 2025 in Dallas, Texas, November 11th through the 13th. This is the biggest Bitcoin mining expo on the planet. See the latest tech and connect with the biggest players in the mining industry. Get your tickets today and don't forget to use code SIMPLYBITCOIN at checkout for 20% off. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and give us a pam and set those notifications. We have a lot more coming your way. So stay tuned, and I'll catch you next time. Love you guys. Peace.
If you prefer to go down with the ship, you.